I'd now also like to call on Maria Ressa, former CNN Jakarta Bureau Chief and former ABS-CBN News and Current Affairs Head. She is now author-in-residence of the International Center for Violence and Terrorism and Research. She is also now a mover on move.ph. Please check that out on Facebook. She will moderate our panel discussion this afternoon. Maria, I turn over the mic to you.
First of all, my gosh, congratulations to the authors for, I have to say, a pretty depressing book. But hopefully our panel will give us hope in how we move forward. This is an incredible room full of people who seem to be dedicated to fighting corruption, who have given up a lot to fight corruption. So let's start. Why don't I start with the first question for our very distinguished panel? And I think it says a lot that a book on military corruption has the Armed Forces Chief of Staff here to attend, showing a great push to reforms. For all four men on the panel, thank you in advance, and let me throw this at you. If you don't mind, we'll start with former Senator, former Defense Secretary Mercado, and then we'll go down the row. All of you are or are in powers of position now. What does military corruption? How do you define the problem, and what have you done? What are you doing to deal with it now?
Well, I guess, well, thank you very much, by the way, and good afternoon to all of you. I'm no longer in government now, so no more titles. Just call me Orly. I'm happy with that, and I'm in the mentoring stage of my life now, so teaching has been my preoccupation. And in the classrooms, this question comes up among my students, knowing that I have served as Secretary of Defense, especially at the height of the exposés of Colonel Rabusa, which all of us were glued to the television set and watching. I'd like to introduce my answer by telling you a story. You know, as Secretary of Defense, I used to visit the camps and disaster sites using the Huey helicopter. Naalala ko yung una akong gumamit niyan. Pagpunta ko sa Villamor, yung CGPAF, yung Commanding General of the Philippine Air Force, sinamahan ako. Tapos sinatid, tubigil kami, nasa harap kami ng Huey. Sabi ko, General, half jokingly, sabi ko, ito bang mga Huey natin, safe ba ito? Sabi niya, yes sir. And my follow-up question was, how can you say they're safe? Sir, we used to have 26. Now we only have 14. The bad ones crashed already, and the good ones are left. Nung umaakyat na yung helicopter, nandun ako sa bintana, I realized he was left there. Hindi pala sumama sa akin. Kumakaway lang sa akin. Sabi ko, the joke is on me. Now, kinukwento ko yan kasi naalala ko yung storyang yan nung nanonood ako ng mga hearings. Lalo na sa mga assurances na binibigay ng armed forces. Now, don't worry, this is a thing of the past. You know, we now have a situation wherein we have plugged the holes, etc. Yung feeling ko, pareho nung feeling ko nung umaakit yung aeroplano at sinabi sa akin na the bad ones crashed already because we know that the helicopters, as yung 26, kumunti ng kumunti yan. And may mga problema talaga. So the problems are still there. Now, we're not saying that as bad as it was in the past, but this is going to be a protracted guerrilla war. Ito, war of attrition ito, hindi ito, we don't win it by press releases, we don't win it by declaring that we have instituted certain reforms. And I know this for a fact, that it's very difficult, having instituted some and started some investigations on the RSBS fund, and now it's bankrupt, no? Ang laki naman yung corruption dun sa veterans fund, which was during my time, the budget of the veterans for the veterans was higher than the budget for the Department of Health. Pag inisip mo yan, isang bahagi lang ng ano, and ngayon lumalaki pa yata yan, no, because of the flaws institutional and in the law and they're legal. So sa akin, my view of this is a multi-headed hydra.
You were a very unpopular defense secretary at the time.
Depends on who you ask.
Now we have the sitting AFP Chief of Staff. 9 months, sir. How do you define the problem and what are you doing about it?
I came, I assumed the position while in the midst of this expose. And at that particular time, I thought that the most urgent thing to do is to institute reforms, knee-jerk. And that's why I had this program on financial and logistics management, which I outlined and which, after a series of workshops and a summit meeting in April, we came up with an 18-point action plan. However, as I started to discharge my functions, I started to discover a lot more things that would not necessarily fall under the financial and logistics concerns, but also on certain processes, systems inside. And so I asked, how can we trigger a more comprehensive reform, not purely centering on finances and logistics? And so we had this. So what I did was that we had a scan of what we're doing. Right at the start of the year, we had the IPSP Bayanihan, its internal peace and security plan. Add to that are the inputs coming from the national security policies, which was authored by Secretary C.P. Garcia, who's here, and a lot of other inputs, and coming also from the Defense Department. And so, with that, I ordered a force structure review. What is a force structure review? It's simply looking at, this is the strategy. Are we structured to implement the objectives of this strategy? So I cannot say, I cannot answer. I do not know. It's probably yes, it's probably no. So what we did was to review. And in the process of the review, we're slowly coming. The review process is now on its 4th month. And we hope to come up with a force structure by this month. The byproduct of this is the table of organization and equipment. I'm sure, sir, you're familiar with that. With that table of organization and equipment, one will have the manpower inventory. We will have the manpower inventory. It's a listing of how many persons should be in a particular unit, and what particular equipment should be in that particular unit. So we'll have a listing. And once it's done, also in this table of organization, we'll have personnel with specific skills that should that should be present in a particular unit. So ang magiging resulta nito is tatamaan din yung personnel management system. No? Pupunta rin tayo doon sa operations and training. No? We'll also go to the logistics and financial management and all other systems. Mas comprehensive siya than just looking at the financial. And of course, is going to be a long process. It's going to be a long process. My intent is that at least at the end of my term in December, I have something to present to the President that is the way to go for the armed forces of the Philippines.
Secretary Abad, the man in charge of the money. Sir, how do you define the problem and what are you doing about it?
It's all over the place. No, but that's not a joke. That is really to say that while it is true that this book exposes the depth of the corruption problem in the military, just going over the budget, we're seeing that this is really a systemic problem and a problem that pervades the bureaucracy. But one of the most opaque institutions, and I'm happy that the mere presence here of General Oban indicates an openness on the part of military to deal with this problem squarely. Because while it is true that at the height of the Senate investigations into the problem, it was then that the President ordered us, myself and General Oban, to look into the problem and present to him recommendations on what needs to be done in the short and in the long term to mitigate the problem. And right away, the DND and the AFP went to a process of diagnosing the problem and looking into various ways by which the problem can be approached. And one of them was mentioned earlier by General Oban, an 18-point policy reform roadmap, which was also submitted to us sometime in late June. And we are going over that, and we hope to be able to sit down with the AFP so that we can also put in our own recommendations as we view it, so that the report to the President is more comprehensive. Although the report of General Oban and the AFP focuses on the AFP's financial management system and issues like disbursements, internal control. And I think it's a good first step. But I think what is critical really is being able to understand where the problem is. Because while it is true that immediately, insofar as DBM is concerned, which is the government's public expenditure guardian, the first thing that we looked at is, of course, the public financial management system. And there's really a lot that needs to be done to deal with, the problems that we're now seeing, the lack of transparency, the lack of accountability in the way public funds are managed in the AFP, which it is, the AFP is under General Oban is beginning to address now. And in the meantime, we at DBM have also begun to address the problem in the areas where we are in a position to make a difference. Although, it's not as comprehensive, as cohesive as we want it to be, but just as a starting point. For example, in dealing with, the whole problem of personnel and, the unfilled items and lack of any information about the military roster. And that's what we first dealt with. And for the first time in the history of budgeting in this country, we now have a roster from the military of personnel, which we are now in coordination with the Civil Service Commission, with the Bureau of Internal Revenue. We are trying to further clean up so that we truly have a roster that is complete. Because we are also preparing next year for a system of payroll that is centralized, and that money is not going to go through the offices anymore, but the salary is going to be paid directly by the National Treasury to the bank accounts of employees. So it's important to have an accurate government manpower inventory system. We're also doing some work in the case of procurement. Towards the end of this year, we are going to pilot test purchase card system with DBM, the Commission on Audit, and the AFP, so that problems like too much dependence on cash advances, disbursements in the AFP were by way of cash advances, and the problem there is you wouldn't know where the money would come from and where it would go. So that's so we're looking forward to sitting down with the military and at the same time presenting to them our own recommendations. But I think beyond financial management, there is a deeper problem here that needs a deeper understanding, because we all know that for the good part of martial rule, the military was used to prop up the authoritarian regime, and for a good part of the previous administration, the military was also used. Now we know to enable the past president to win, and at the same time to ensure her political survival, and being instrumentalized in that way has put the military certainly in the center stage of power, and given them a lot of perks, but at the same time it reduced the military to a pawn in the political game, and part of the whole deeply embedded political patronage system in this country. And that is the problem there is systemic and cultural, and I think it is something that the military should recognize, because unless it is diagnosed as such, what the most beautifully designed financial management and procurement system will not be able to deal with that. But just as a last point, we have been for the most part inward looking, especially the military, but our environment is changing. The regional as well as the global environment is changing, and it also means that the military has to begin to review and identify its place, its role in this whole scheme of rapidly changing environment, especially since I think under this government, because of its thrust on good governance and poverty reduction, as well as the judicial reforms and the rule of law, I think being focused on mainly on insurgency and failing to see what is happening beyond us in the region, I think will be a big mistake, and I think the military also has to prepare for that, and that means a new set of functions and roles that the military has to begin to play. And unfortunately, I think it has not been able to do that, and I think that process has to begin.
We'll go with Representative Abaya, who is head of the appropriations at House, very powerful in terms of oversight.
That's a misperception. Well, first of all, on military corruption, definitely it's not exclusive to the military. I don't think they are synonymous, that military equals corruption. And I look forward to the day when somebody's asked, what's the first word you would think of when corruption is mentioned? And I look forward to the day that military wouldn't be the first word to be mentioned. On the question what I have done, I was commissioned in 1988 as a naval officer. Chances are, wittingly or unwittingly, I was part of it too. I retired as a lieutenant commander, not in a position to really reform the institution. But now, as a member of Congress, what we have done, the good secretary that just didn't mention that we are separating the unfilled positions now. That shall remain. There are talks of returning Supreme Court. I see ETA here. CHR is probably also a concerned agency. We are putting them back in their respective budget, but those under the executive shall remain under the MPBF. So they will still comply with the requirements set by the good secretary. And the only objective here is transparency. There would be issues on fiscal autonomy, but like we've said, this is round one. There are 11 rounds to go. Likewise, on what could be done too on the budget, because I think there's a mutual mistrust between the executive and the military. While, as mentioned in the book, there is almost zero capital outlay for the AFP, but we know there is PS. But on the other side, DBM traditionally wouldn't grant those capital outlay because they knew there was excess in PS. So it was a mutual distrust with people anticipating what the other would do. As part of the tightening on the personal fund, I for one took the initiative to ask the executive to add another 100 million to increase the intelligence fund of the AFP. So this should be good news for the AFP. At least the version that will come out from the House would have 100 million additional for intelligence fund. And for all the offices that we could get this from, it is the Office of the President that has agreed to shed off 100 million from his funds to divert it to the AFP. So, as part of the tightening, we also make way of indeed giving them the needed funds to properly operate. One thing, likewise, we could do, because reading through the book, I stayed up till 3 a.m. just to prepare for this forum. And what really struck me there were the quotations on the letter of Secretary Reyes. In essence, we see a lot of AFP officers here. We are born into the system. And young lieutenants, young ensigns in the Navy are put in positions of responsibility, not knowing what COA procedures are, what bidding procedures are. You're just thrust in there to perform your basic job, whatever that would be. And it is not a primary concern of a young lieutenant to determine every time while he's performing his job what is right or wrong. If you ask the military officers here what would be the two most important things for a professional officer, it will be men and mission. First is mission accomplishment, next is welfare of the men. So conversion as it is lends a very flexible tool to address the true priorities of an AFP officer. Mission accomplishment and welfare of the men. And with the permission of the Chief of Staff, I'd recommend that this book become mandatory reading for cadets in the PMA. Hopefully that would help out in extra revenues for the little advertisement here. But it is helpful because a young lieutenant reading the book would have a glimpse of what really happens. Rather than during our time, there was no such book. We tried to figure out what was happening. So through that, you could get their feet wet quickly, and questions could be asked early.
What struck me about the book is that there are all these nice terms that if you're not familiar with the military or with budget procurement or any of these, they don't sound bad. Things like conversion or PS, which all of you have used, right? So it seems to have, when you're reading it, you just go, oh, okay. But then when you look at it, you realize that conversion is illegal, that they're falsifying receipts, that these are things that in a civilian position, someone could go to jail for, or someone certainly would be sanctioned for. I guess what was interesting to me, and I'd like to ask for your thoughts on this, is that it seems like it's so, Secretary Abad said this, it's endemic in our culture, it's a cultural thing, so it definitely isn't just the military. But in a situation like this where it's concrete, where there are specific rules, what are the personal hazards of the people who actually go out to try to change it? Glenda, in her presentation, mentioned 3 men, Noel Miano, Dick Morales, and the former naval chief, Wong, who is now in the U.S. He left. You left the service also, former lieutenant in the Navy. We know what happened to Colonel Rabusa when he came out against it. the people who fight corruption. Former Secretary Mercado. There was, in the book, it said that you were facing more danger inside the AFP compound than among the
Hindi ako tumatawid
insurgents.
sa gabi sa loob ng kampo. Dahil maraming mga 6x6 truck dun. Baka mawala ng preno eh. Pero ito, sasabihin ko lang, no? I've never thought I'd hear it from the Chief of Staff, and I'm so happy to hear it. You think it's a small thing that he mentioned, the table of organization and equipment. But I would like to tell you during my time, when I was sponsoring the modernization program, I practically held the armed forces hostage by refusing to bring out the bill unless they submit a table of organization and equipment. Ang tagal talagang hindi, para kang dumudukot ng bayawak sa lungga. And now we realize why. Because that would require yung
Seated.
personnel,
Yes.
magkakaalaman dyan, and that's the basis of conversion, yung PS funds. So now we know that you have real good steps, concrete steps, by coming up with a table of organization and equipment. In general, I never thought I'd see the day when it will come, and it comes from you. Ang challenge talaga natin now is this, and I think we all know it. After General Oban, after this administration, kaya sabi ko, war of attrition yan eh. BSDU ang mangyayari yan. Balik sa dating ugali. Hindi yung Barrio Self-Defense Unit, kung hindi balik sa dating ugali. And we are in real danger. And the flaws today is that we focus on the personalities. I accept na, I'm bombastic, etc. There are guys who really hated my style, etc. I'm as subtle as a Sherman tank. So I don't, I come in strong. But aside from the personalities, what has been done to institutionalize these things? Has Congress been doing its job in ensuring that these reforms stick? Because if it is dependent on the executive, walang mangyayari dito eh. Babalik at babalik yan. Now, I'm glad we have the technology now. It can be used, We can have, I tried one, just to make a statement, yung e-commerce, just, wala pang batas nun ng e-commerce, just to show that it can be done. But I'll tell you, I had an experience when Secretary Cruz became Secretary of Defense. Sabi niya sa akin, meron ka na palang reorganization. Sabi ko, approve ka yan ng ni Presidente Erap. Alam mo, sabi sa akin, wala akong makitang dokumento sa loob ng Defense Department. Not a single copy. Mabuti na lamang, lahat tayo manggagaling sa, we have our own copies and we were able to give him. It is easy to bury these things. And we don't have focus in terms of our attention. Mangyayari nito, we're here. Kaya, I'm not overemphasizing the importance of documentation. That's the reason why this book is very important. Our initiative, for example, in defense, in the Joint Defense Assessment, and the program for reform for defense, and then this book, we have the tools now, and I'm glad it is now in paper, and let us put it online, and let us hold our officers to account for it. Now, we know there are so many men and women in the armed forces that are really outstanding in terms of integrity. So it is truly unfair to say military equals corruption. Corruption, this is only a microcosm of the problem of corruption.
Correct.
But it can be done, and it's now being done. But like everybody, we trust you that you will reform. But as Reagan would say, trust but verify. Yun ang gusto naman natin. Media is here to perform that function. And that's the reason why this book is important.
General Oban, you talked
May
about
just
the TO.
Yes,
please, sir.
follow
Yes.
on the statements of Secretary of Orly, sir. That's true. Yung table of organization and equipment, parang napaka-inosenteng, simpleng document. But this is a basic document for a military organization. Ang tawag ko nga dyan, PRISM. Once ilawan yan, mag-i-emit siya ng ibang race. Yun yung mga management programs na dapat gawin as byproducts of this table of organization and equipment. Doon manggagaling lahat ito eh. Planning, programming will start from there. Meron din tayong, we have right now ongoing projects under the Philippine Defense Reform. This was a product of the Joint Defense Assessment undertaken by the Philippines and the United States from late 90s to early 2000. There are programs ongoing on personnel, on information management, on logistics, but then we think that we'll have to hold this first and finish the table of organization and equipment, so that it's going to be along the lines of the development programs. So that's what I'm saying. The last TOE that we had, table of organization and equipment, to my recollection, was in 2004, and wala. So that in terms of personal services or PS, it's always pegged at. It's always referred to as the authorized troop strength, because we don't have any concrete basis for how strong should an armed forces be. With this, we can very well say through that there was science in coming up with this number, and this is the recommended strength of the armed forces in order for us to perform our mandate more effectively and efficiently.
Just for those who haven't yet read the book, the PS, the Personal Services, and the Intelligence Fund, according to the authors, are the ones which were really manipulated funds. The funds were a slush fund for many of the officers. Sir, let me just ask you, let me just follow up before we go to Secretary Abad. You talked about the TO. Yes, that's incredibly important. But the culture of corruption. I guess the first is, how do you change that? And is 9 months enough?
As I said, it's not going to be overnight. It's going to be a long process. And so my intent really is to come up with a blueprint in 2 months' time. I guess the table of organization will be out by end of October or mid-November. And from there, we can already present a blueprint for other development programs that we see would be essential in making an armed forces really professional.
Secretary Abad.
Well, it's good that General Oban mentioned the Philippine Defense Reform Program, because for me, I think we have to get back on track following that program, because it's really the comprehensive program. It's strategy driven. It involves multi-year planning process, and it looks at the different, priorities, and sets, the logistical requirement, which translates to eventually operational and requirements. Because like I noticed in the past, with reference to the AFP modernization program, I noticed the DBM just kept getting list of equipments. If you look at what is the basis of, then the list of equipment seem to change with the chief of staff. So sometimes you wonder whether is it driven by the chief of staff's inclination, or is it driven by suppliers? In fact, there was one time, 2010, where 5 billion pesos worth of AFP modernization fund was not spent. In fact, still with me. and I think that's why I keep saying that it all starts with a really good assessment of what's the terrain, and what's the role of the AFP. Because even the table of organization, because the management structure is really dictated by what's the strategy and the key programs that you want to implement, and therefore you didn't say what sort of people, how many people do you need to run this, and how do you organize it so that you can perform the objectives. I think the AFP has to go back to the Philippine Defense Reform Program, because I can understand the presentation made by General Oban, because he's looking at being able to leave a legacy in the 9 months that he is Chief of Staff. And that's why I think a lot of the recommendations are recommendations that he would want to pursue while he's head of the AFP. But as you said, and as he also admitted, that the solutions go beyond 9 months, and that's why I think to look at what ought to be done, whether it's short term, medium term, or long term. I think using the framework of the Philippine Defense Reform Program is a good way of looking at it.
Actually, sir, you're the right person to answer this.